Hello, my name's Jade and today I'm going to be going through some recommendations for the colder months of the year. Autumn is coming to an end. I know that November is technically a autumn month, but to me it always felt more like winter. My birthday's in November, and so the amount of things we could do for my birthday was always really limited because everything was too cold. And historically it just feels like the weather's more wintry than it is autumnal, although in the past few years with global warming, less so, I will admit. But we're getting towards the colder months. I'm already starting to think about the books that I want to read in winter. I really look forward to reading in winter. I think there's something really cozy about it. I love the escapism and I love reading really atmospheric books in winter. And the books that make me think of those cozy, more atmospheric months, they really stick with me. Like, there are certain books that when I think of them, I just think about reading them in a colder month and the time when I read it, and it just has that vibe to it and I love it so much. So I thought I'd recommend some of those books to you. I tried to keep this list to 10 and it was a struggle, so I do have some honourable mentions along the way, books that are kind of similar. There's no particular order to these books. They're mostly in fantasy, mystery and historical fiction because those are the genres that I think of when it comes to these months. I think those books lend really well to being really heavily atmospheric and cozy and just the darker nights. We're gonna jump straight into the good stuff. The first book that really makes me think of winter, and it is set in winter so it makes sense, is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This is one of my all-time favourite books. We're talking top 3. I have a tattoo on the inside of my arm that's a quote from this book. Really, really beautifully written, and it's definitely very, very atmospheric. Erin Morgenstern is known for having heavily atmospheric books. I say that she has 2, and her other book, The Night Circus, is an honourable mention. I feel like it's kind of sacrilegious to make this list and not have this be on here, but I would argue this one lends better to that wintry feeling atmosphere. This one takes place during winter. I vividly remember there being snow in it. This one, I think, lends better to the autumnal vibe. It's about a travelling circus at night. If you don't know what the night circus is, if you've been living under a rock, I think you remember there being a lot of description of bonfires and smokiness. So I do think it lends well to autumn. It's very heavily atmospheric. There's kind of dark magic vibes in here, so it does lend really well to these months as well. But when I think of this type of year and I think about those kinds of atmospheric books that lend really well to winter, The Starless Sea is one of the very first ones that come to mind. Because it's set during winter, for a start, it's also fantasy. Magical realism? Is it magical realism? Is it urban fantasy? Who knows? Very convoluted plot. It kind of feels like you're going through a maze. There's layers upon layers to the stories in this one. It feels like something you should spend your evenings poring over and trying to figure out. So it is very confusing. I would definitely preface that. The atmosphere is so good. I would argue that it does have a plot. I would argue that a lot of it does come to make sense by the end, although I know a lot of people don't like it because it's so weird and confusing. Symbols that come up again and again are things like books and candles and cats and cocktails and smoke and amber and honey. It's very sensuous and sumptuous. Is sensuous even a word? What am I trying to say? Very difficult one to give you a synopsis for. We're following Zachary Rawlings. He discovers a book of stories, and one of the stories is about him, and so he then kind of becomes obsessed with this book and trying to figure out why he's in this book, what's going on, where does it belong to, and he kind of ends up going down this rabbit hole of an adventure. It's just, I think it's a beautiful book. I'm biased, it's one of my absolute favourites, but I think it really, really, really lends well to this time of year. I would highly recommend reading this over a cold winter night. Next up, we're sticking with magical realism, and we have The Book Eaters by Sunyi Dean. This is really unique. It's one of the most unique books I've ever read. I remember finishing it just feeling like I've never read anything quite like this. We're living in a world where there's things called the book eaters, and these are essentially people that eat books. They're not quite human. They do have sharper teeth, and there's a whole system of some of them can be darker. There is a kind of book eater, I can't remember its name off the top of my head, but they eat human minds. Our lead character, her child, is one of these kinds of book eaters that eat people, and so she's keep having to get this medicine for him. She's kind of an outcast from her society, and this society of book eaters is really intense. There's a lot of rules. We're flashing to modern day with her and her kid, and back in time of how she ended up in this situation. It has a lot of fairy tale motifs in it, and I think that lends really well because we're talking about books. Obviously is such an important part of this book, and her story, the way it kind of fits those archetypes and It does it in a really fresh and interesting way though. It has a very dark atmosphere, very gritty feeling. When I think of it, I have such a vivid memory of like the tone of this book. Again, I think it just lends really well to reading at nighttime. I would highly recommend checking this one out if it sounds at all interesting. Really actually don't know what genre I would put this one in. I have it with my historical fiction, but it's not technically. And that's Melmoth by Sarah Perry. I think the reason I have it in my historical fiction is because she also wrote The Essex Serpent, which is historical fiction. And again, this is another honourable mention that I think lends really well to reading in autumn and winter. It's set on the cold moors of Essex. The landscape, again, is just very wintry, but also it's very mysterious. We're dealing a lot with religion, we're dealing with mythical creatures, we're dealing with a very small town, but it's also quite literary in the way it's told. The themes are very subtle. None of it is in your face. It's all just in the tone of it. So I think this one lends really well to winter as well. I recommend this one, I think in part because it takes place predominantly in Prague during winter, I believe. When I visited Prague, it was in the winter, so when I think of Prague, it feels like a very winter city to me. It's got like a little bit of an ooky spooky feeling. I feel like I read this one during October. I'm gonna link the videos where I originally discussed all of these in the description if you want to find out more detail of my thoughts. Melmoth, I feel like is a real character like in the world, like outside of this book, but I can't remember. But it's basically the idea of like the wandering Jew. And in this book it's a she, although I think typically they are a he. And she goes around punishing people. There's a lot of like flashbacks, I suppose, to historic events. I remember there was one during the war. We get to see our narrators past at one point. I think there's a couple of these people that take place during these like atrocious crimes, and I can't remember how involved they were exactly, but then them being haunted by Melmoth. And Melmoth is a very haunting figure. She felt like she was haunting me. After I finished this book, this book really stuck with me for a long time. And although I have a lot of love for the Essex Serpent, I feel like this one's the more charming, a little bit cozier of the two. I think Melmoth is just so well executed. Our lead character is an academic, and she, if I recall correctly, one of her colleagues was looking into Melmoth, and then he ended up disappearing. And so she then takes on the mantle of the research and then going back through like all these historic events, and yeah, walks the line between supernatural and like magical realism because of this Melmoth figure. Like, is she real? Isn't she real? What is she? Like I said, predominantly is contemporary, but those like flashbacks to like historic time periods really does make it feel like it spans across time and it's kind of timeless in a way. If you're gonna read it at any time of year, it has to be either autumn or winter. I just can't imagine reading this in the summer and it feeling the same. It's very mysterious and dark, and it's very well written. Again, it has a literary feeling. It's so interesting and unique. Next up we have a mystery, and that's The Wonder by Emma Donoghue. This one takes place during Ireland, and again predominantly during winter. Well, I mean, Ireland is always cold anyway. What time period exactly? Post-Crimean War. Our lead character was trained by Florence Nightingale. She's a nurse. She's sent to Ireland, a very, very small Irish village. In this village there is a girl. I think she's like 11 or 10 or something. 11. She hasn't eaten anything for 3 months, so she should either be very, very ill or dead. She's neither. And so Lib, our main character, a nurse, and a nun who is also supposedly medically trained. I remember just thinking of her as a nun nurse, but I don't really know what she was. They're sent to observe her, strictly just to observe, just to see what's happening. Not necessarily to prove or disprove, but just to see what is happening. Lib, though, takes it upon herself to try and figure out what's going on, of course. It's a very slow burn mystery, but I remember just being completely absorbed the whole time. Again, we have these religious metaphors, very similarly to the Essex Serpent. To be honest, I feel like these two are comparable in a lot of ways. Like these really outspoken, strongly opinionated women who want the best, ultimately, battling these like religious, erring on supernatural forces. They have very different feelings to them though, like other than that they're not quite the same. We're very much immersed in like the family life because stays with Anne and her family and like for long periods of time. I remember being completely transported away to this small Irish town and I was obsessed with figuring out what was going on here. The only thing I think I'd preface with this one is that it is very, very slow burn. I didn't mind that. I was entertained throughout the whole thing. I loved the little clues. And I just loved spending my time here, and you're so preoccupied with all this, like, thinking of, like, is this okay? Like, how much power should the church have over our community? Again, it's almost nearing on similar to Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, which I just finished recently, and I did consider putting in this video. I think if you like one of these, you might like the other. Very similar questions and themes happening. Both take place in small Irish villages. Very different vibes, but again, both take place over winter. This one's much cozier, it's more modern, takes place during the 80s over Christmas. This one takes place much before that in a very wet, sticky, muddy part of Ireland. I adored this. It's like one of those books that's really close to being a favourite. Everything Emma Donoghue writes is incredible anyway. I'm going to try and do this one quickly, because I feel like this is one of the much more obvious recommendations. Everyone's heard of this book, but again, it felt wrong to not include it on this list. It felt like I had to. And that's The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Again, this one takes place over winter, so naturally it makes me think of winter. It's a mystery, it's dark academia. Again, both things that lend very well to autumn and winter anyway. I'm pretty sure at the very beginning of this one, we see someone die. Yeah, we do. And then we kind of jump back in time and trying to, like, get to the point of, like, when this person was killed. How did we get here? The subject these students are learning is, like, classics and ancient Greece and Latin and all of those kinds of topics. Like, the dark academia element of it very much lends to, like, critiquing the privilege and their relationship with education and just, like, life in general, to be honest, their experience with it. It's got tinges of darkness in there for, like, I mean, it's dark academia obviously, but there's murder and there's weird things afoot, and the more you read it, the weirder they seemingly become. And then since we're on a little train of mysteries here, why don't we stick with it with Eileen by Otesha Moshfegh. This is one that I'm a little bit more hesitant to say, like, I strongly recommend this one. Like, I think all of these books up to this point, I would strongly recommend them. I really thoroughly enjoyed them. I remember having a couple problems with Eileen. Can't fully remember what they were other than it being too slow, especially in the beginning. When I think of those heavily atmospheric books that take place during winter time, this is one of the first books that come to mind. Like, the atmosphere and the feeling of it feels very distinct to me, and I haven't read anything quite like it, or even like watched. Like, I watched the film as well, and nothing I've consumed, no other media has compared. It does take place during Christmas as well. It's a very gritty kind of wintry book. We're following Eileen. She just lives with her dad, who is an alcoholic. She doesn't have the best home life, needless to say. It's very dreary. She doesn't really have a lot to look forward to in her life. She works at, like, a correctional facility, like a prison for young boys. Someone new joins this prison, Rebecca, and Eileen is basically just, like, infatuated by her, and they become friends. It takes a long while for us to get there. When it ramps up, though, it does ramp up. Just this town, the setting of this feels so vivid in my mind. It's almost like I've been there. The darkness of it, the crime and mystery element, the grittiness feels very distinct. Pretty much any book by Agatha Christie, very, very, very different vibe. I feel like every Agatha Christie book is gonna inherently be cozy just because of the time period it was written in and the writing style. By no means a cozy mystery, it's by no means cozy crime, it's just got that quaintness of the time period. Very, very, very readable, at least all of the books I've read from her. They're so addicting. I'm holding up The Mysterious Affair of Styles, which is the first Poirot, and I particularly love Poirot. I mean, this is the only, like, full-length novel of hers I read, but I've read quite a few short stories as well, and obviously watched the films. I love Poirot. I think he particularly is extra cozy because he's just so silly and funny. And I feel like this one actually takes place during the summertime, so it might not be the most apt, but it's the only Poirot I have. I do also have Midwinter Murder by Agatha Christie, which is set during winter, if you couldn't tell by the cover. The reason this one wasn't the first one that came to mind was because it's short story, so it didn't stick with me as well, but I did enjoy it. I have a mixture of, like, Marple, Poirot, probably some Tommy and Tuppence as well, some that are none of those things. The other one of hers I've read is And Then There Were None, which I know is incredibly popular, and there's a new edition of this one out as well, like the Ultimate Mystery Edition. I wasn't obsessed with it just because I found the clues of who did it so buried that, like, I was just blindly guessing. But naturally this one is also very popular. I mean, it must be like the #1 best-selling mystery for a reason. It takes place on a little private island kind of situation, and I feel like it was pretty stormy there, so maybe this one would lend better. To be fair, I was addicted to both of these while reading them. This one, the mystery, I just found to be more satisfying, but that is almost definitely a very unpopular opinion. But then if you've read And Then There Were None and it didn't knock your socks off, maybe give one of her others a go. But Agatha Christie, and in particular Poirot, is one of the things I'm definitely going to find myself reading this winter time, I can guarantee it. This next one is crossing over a few different genres, so it is a mystery, but it's a historical mystery. And that is The Square of Sevens by Laura Shepherd Robinson. This one's a really unique one as well, where the mystery just like it took me on such a journey, and there were some things that were so cleverly done in here. So The Square of Sevens, it's like, I think it's to do with predicting on cards. Our main character, I want to say her name was Red. It is Red, although she probably almost definitely gets her name changed quite a few times throughout the process of this book. Her dad dies, they were travelers, they were like fortune tellers, ends up being adopted by this kind man. She has this whole mystery with where she came from and her parents, and there's this like deep family like lore basically. We go through so many different like versions in here. Like we have the beginning with her and this adopted father. She strikes out on her own for a little while and does her prediction thing. She joins this wealthy family to kind of try and figure out more of like how they're connected to her past. It was really well written, it was really transportive. What time period is this set in? The historical time setting was really vivid, it really took me there. The mystery was just really unique and fresh, and I mean, it's quite a long book as you can see, but it's worth the length because you go through so many different like versions of the truth and experiences, and it's just it felt very unique. I hadn't read anything quite like it again since. If you like historical fiction and you like mysteries and you like any of the kind of motifs that come up in here, I think you might really like this. Next up is Weyward by Amelia Hart. So in this one we're following 3 generations of women all within the same family, and there's something a little bit uncouth about these women. They're connected to nature in a way most are not. It's kind of witchy vibes. Witchy vibes indeed. In 2019 we're following Kate, who's fleeing an abusive relationship. She goes to the Weyward cottage. Weyward is the name of the cottage, and that's what connects all 3 of these women. All 3 of these women live in this cottage at some stage during their lives. It's passed down through the family. We have Violet in 1942, who I loved her storyline, and her storyline is a little bit sad. There are some trigger warnings to look into for this one. In 1619 we have Alpha, and this is like real ye olde witch hunting times. I loved those 3 different time periods because the way we look at like accusing women in all 3 of these times is so different and distinct. 2 of these women I rooted for so hard. It all felt so distinct, and yet I cared about them all so much. When I think of this book, I really think about that cottage and the gardens within it. And I think witchy kind of books, those more mysterious, slightly darker leaning books, suit winter and autumn. I don't think it takes place during winter necessarily. In fact, I kind of have a feeling a lot of it takes place during spring and summer. It's that darker atmosphere to it, and that historical element, and the mystery of like how exactly do all 3 of these women connect and what's going on with all of them. All of them have their own kind of little predicaments, if you will. Or I think about it more, I'm like, nothing about this strike like is particularly makes me think of like winter or autumn, and yet I kept coming back to it when thinking of books to recommend for this video. It's a gorgeous book that I just really highly recommend if you haven't read it. And then lastly, I struggled with what to come up with this last one. There's a lot of books that could fit, like Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, by Holly Black. There's a short story collection that I really love called The Haunting Season, which is literally a book of ghost stories for winter nights, and I loved every single book in the story. But I kept coming back to this one book that I read during November, and when I think of this book, I cannot help but think about the month of November and like cold winter nights, and that is The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. I don't know about you, but I love reading high fantasy during winter specifically. Like, just take me away from here. Take me away. If like there's ever a month where you want the escapism the most and it's comes the most easily, I feel like it's winter. It's just something about high fantasy and winter that goes in hand in hand together. If you haven't read high fantasy during winter and you're a fantasy lover, you gotta do it. You gotta do it. I was so tempted to read the prequel to this one in November as well, but there were just so many books I wanted to read this year that it's not gonna happen. But I'm thinking the first book I'm gonna read in January is the prequel. I can't ever remember what it's called. These names are so complicated. Like, this is a very popular book, so I'm not going to dwell too long on the premise, and even if I did dwell too long on the premise, it probably won't make sense, because it's high fantasy. We're living in a world where there's dragons. They're actually called worms. I think worms and dragons are two separate things, if I'm not mistaken. There's the West and the East, and they both have very different relationships with worms and dragons. In the East, they learn to ride them, and in the West, they're heavily frowned upon. Big ancient worm dragon, I'm pretty sure it's a worm, that nearly destroyed the world, and then it went into hiding, but they're starting to think he might come back up again. This one again has a lot of mystery vibes. It's a gigantic puzzle that we're trying to figure out. I loved it. That's why there's so many tabs in here, because I was theorizing and I got really stuck into the lore. The only problem I had with this book is the end battle was ever so slightly rushed. It just wasn't as climactic as it deserved to be for the length of this book. But I was obsessed with it. I adored it so much. I cannot wait to go back into this world. So those were all the books that I recommend for these colder months. Hopefully they've inspired you. You've discovered something that you wouldn't otherwise. Please, please, please let me know what your favourite kind of books to read in these months are. If you have any recommendations, please let me know in the comments. But that is all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening / night. My name's Jade. I hope I see you again next time. Goodbye!